Hi, we're back in San Francisco. I think it must be a nice city. At least it certainly looks beautiful from the outside. We're going to have just 3 segments here, short ones, on Galatians chapter 1. If you are still translating or you haven't started translating Galatians chapter 1, you're late. So your homework from this point will be marked as late. It should have been finished last week and uploaded to Moodle. I think it's important that we take a look at Galatians. It is very different from the Gospel of John. And so I think there are things we need to point out. I would mention that I'm not going to read the text. That's your job from this point on. I'm going to post links to Eddie Lantz and his reading of Galatians, each chapter. And you should practice listening once and then read along in Greek. Read the chapter, read out loud, and then commence translation. The more familiar you get with the text, the better it is. But again, we're not going to do that now. I'm going to, because it's going to take too much time, and we need to focus on aspects that are especially important. What I would like for you to do, and I'll just mention this now, as you go through translating Galatians and reading Galatians, translating into English, getting familiar with the meaning of the text and its translation into English, that you mark uses. Number 1, uses of the infinitive. Number 2, uses of the participle. And number 3, any uses of the subjunctive mood. These things have caused us some difficulty in the past, and we need to get more familiar with them. So as you go through the text, is the infinitive used in a particular way, or it is used in a particular way? What way is that? Same with participles, which that is especially important. Never skip over a participle. Always mark next to it, make a comment. This participle is used here as we will discover in Galatians 1, most of them are adjectival or substantival participles. We're going to look at one that isn't at the very end of our 3 sessions together. And the subjunctive mood, which use, and we have 10 of them. 9 are listed on your KMP chart. And we added a 10th that Dr. Campbell suggests, and I think he's right in suggesting it, that we have 10 uses of the subjunctive. And you should know those. We learned those back in Greek too, and they should be very familiar to you by now. So let's go to Galatians chapter 1. And before we jump, let's see, I went to it here, but I forgot to share my screen, so let me do that. There, that's more like it. Now you should be seeing my first slide. Galatians, what Christianity is and what it is not. And personally, I think this is one of the most important writings in the New Testament. I'm sure that most Christians would say if they had to pick one of the epistles as the most important, they would usually pick Romans. And certainly Romans is a letter or an epistle. An epistle is kind of different from a letter. They're not quite the same, but anyway, written at a time when the Apostle Paul had evidently more time to reflect and to had summarize the reasons that he went to the Gentiles, the gospel that he proclaimed among the Gentiles, and why it was superior to the message that Jewish Christians often wanted to force upon the outside world. Galatians is different from Romans, though, in that Galatians was written earlier. It was probably the first epistle of Paul, time-wise. It's also written in a more emergency style. It was penned probably just before he went down to Jerusalem to defend, with Barnabas, to defend his message. And it kind of reflects that emergency situation. He must say very quickly what he needs to say. And in doing so, he details for us the most important aspects of the gospel message. So by being an emergency epistle, as it were, coming out of an emergency situation, this has to be said quickly, and he had to leave quickly on a journey with Barnabas. The essentials are more evident. They're evident in Romans too, but there'll be more Old Testament scriptures quoted and explained and laid out in detail. Here we have the essence. So if you want to get the simple gospel without too much explanation around it, that might make it more difficult, especially for new believers, I think Galatians is one of the best places to start. I've called it What Christianity Is and What It Is Not, and why that makes a difference. Again, as you go through and study the Greek text, always ask yourself, why did the author, why did Paul, why did John, why did Luke, why did Mark use this expression when he could have used another one? Why did he say, politeuomai, live out your citizenship? He could have made it very simple in Greek and said praso or poieo, agatha erga, do good works. Instead, he says, live out your citizenship. What you have to think more about rather than do good works is easier to understand. But politeuomai, I'm talking about now Philippians 1:27, has a special kind of emphasis to it, more intense in a way, more content, more background, makes us think about what the Christian life is. So why did the apostles use this term here and not another one? We may not always know, but at least it helps us to think about what they are saying. Now we're going to go through, first of all, in this segment, the only thing and the main thing I want to talk about is the timeline, which seems rather boring, really, but Paul spends a good deal of this chapter, and in particular, the portion of the chapter that you weren't required to translate because we had enough work this week that I didn't want to add verses 11 to 18. But these verses detail the historical timeline and show to us exactly how many years passed between Paul's conversion and his going to the Galatians. And now he's writing a letter just before he goes back down to Jerusalem to a conference that's talked about for us in Acts chapter 15. There are 14 years that are referred to in in Galatians chapter 2, verse 1. And if you notice here, I have 46 AD, Paul's second visit to Jerusalem. Now, being a good American 20th century, I have to have this timeline, 33 AD, 36 AD, 36 to 46 AD. These, of course, are years in the first century, and you won't find them in the Bible anywhere. Paul doesn't say, oh, I was converted in 33 AD. But we can figure out from the things we know in history, for example, what's called the Edict of Claudius, the Roman emperor, when that was. We know when that was in history. And we know when Jesus died and was resurrected, that was the year 30, because certain days had to line up. The Passover had to be on a Friday, and there were certain years where that could take place. 30, 33, but 33 becomes too late. So most likely it's the year 30. If we work backwards, Paul's 14 years, we end up at AD 33 when he meets the Lord on the road to Damascus. After many days, Acts tells us, Paul tells us in Galatians 1:18 that it was 3 years after his conversion that he first went to Jerusalem. We know from Acts chapter 9 that he then went to Tarsus, and then that Barnabas went there in that region to look for him. And the verb seems to suggest that he had a hard time finding him because he sought him until he found him and then brought him to Antioch sometime in that, somewhere in that timeline. So he spent some time at home in the place where he came from. He came from Tarsus in Cilicia, which is now part of Turkey. But of course, much of what is in the book of Acts takes place in what we now call Turkey, the country of Turkey, I mean. So 3 years from his conversion, he goes down to Jerusalem. And between the years, then that would be 36, the year 36. Between the year 36 and 46, he spends some time at home, and then he's brought to Antioch to help lead the church. And then in Galatians 2, verse 1, he says that he went down to Jerusalem again because of a revelation. I think that revelation is Acts chapter 11, verses 27 to 30, where the prophet Agabus stands up and says there's going to be a famine. And as a result of that revelation, Paul and Barnabas, and perhaps some others, certainly Titus, who was a Gentile. Luke never talks about Titus in the book of Acts, but Paul does in his epistles. Paul and Barnabas and Titus went down to Jerusalem to deliver a collection, to deliver some help for the poor, for the persecuted church in Jerusalem, to help them, because in Antioch, they were much better off economically than they were down in Jerusalem. Jerusalem was a place of persecution, a place of great difficulty, for the new disciples. And after that visit, Paul and Barnabas returned to Antioch, and then they went on Paul's first missionary journey, Paul and Barnabas's first missionary journey, to the area of the Galatians. And that brings us in the epistle of Galatians, when they return to the time in which he wrote this letter, just before he went down to Jerusalem for the council that's talked about in Acts chapter 15, in which he sets forth basically what he talks about in Galatians. So that's our timeline. I should have mentioned that on this slide, there are some dates that we do know from history when they happened. That's how we can work backwards and forwards from these dates and figure out when things took place. This word hepeta, after, there occurs 3 times in Galatians, and always means after this period, the following happened. There's a period of 14 years then between Paul's conversion and the time where we're talking about now, where he's where he is explaining his message before he goes down to Jerusalem to defend it. 2 other things to mention before in this section, first part. When Paul talks about he went off into Arabia. In Galatians, he said he went to Arabia. In Corinthians, 2 Corinthians chapters 11 and 12, he talks about going to Arabia. Arabia, by Arabia, he doesn't mean Saudi Arabia. He means the Arabia of his time. And that would be the border of that kingdom went almost right up to Damascus, the capital of Syria. This was called the Arabian kingdom of Nabatea. When Paul went out into this area, he didn't have to go far to get into Arabia. It wasn't like he had to go way down hundreds of miles to get to Saudi Arabia or to Yemen or someplace like that. That can be often a misunderstanding. Another misunderstanding that's often assumed is that he went down in Arabia and he sat under a tree for 3 years and listened to God talking to him, and had revelations of Jesus, and basically had a spiritual retreat. Well, he probably did have some spiritual retreat in those 3 years, and the many days. In Acts, it just says in chapter 9, after many days. So during those many days. But 2 Corinthians also says that the king of Arabia was persecuting him, and he fled back to Damascus. And while he was in Damascus, the Jews were persecuting him, so they let him down over a wall, and then he escaped and went down to Jerusalem. He was always being persecuted. So I assume that when he was in Arabia, he was not just having a spiritual retreat. He was active in preaching the gospel. Paul was always active. He was never sort of just taking time to go sit under a tree. I'm sure he spent time with the Lord, but we have to get that in perspective. So these are aspects we understand the 14 years, and then after he is brought to Antioch, and I'm going to give these slides to you so you have them yourself. I don't have to go through all these points. Paul's early travels. He then goes on his first missionary journey with Barnabas and also with John Mark as far as Cyprus. When they arrive here on the coast, John Mark, Mark as we know him simply, goes back for whatever reason, we're not sure. And then Paul goes into this area, which was known as Galatia. And this is the area where the churches are founded in Acts chapter 13 and 14. And to these churches, Paul will write this letter, Galatians. Now, in Germany, it's still popular to say that this is not the Galatia to whom the Galatian letter is written, but that Galatia is way up here in the north. It is true that the Romans did call this area up here also Galatia, but in fact, this area was called in the vernacular, we say, the words that the common people use, they would also refer to this area as Galatia. Quite frankly, I can't prove it because there's not enough evidence to say that what's called the North Galatia theory is not true. But quite frankly, I find that when in God's word, God is very consistent in giving us background for the more doctrinal letters, our doctrinal things, the teaching part of Scripture, by giving us historical background of what happened in that place. And I would find it strange that he would give us so much, like in the Epistle of Galatians and the Epistle of Romans, about an area here that, if the North Galatian theory were true up here, we would know nothing about. I'm pretty convinced with most, I would say, English-speaking scholars in England, America, that it is this area, or South Galatia, that is referred to in the Galatian letter to whom Paul is writing here. It is interesting, though, that theories tend to stay in certain regions of the world still today, that German scholars will tend to be North Galatian theory. British and American scholars will tend to be South Galatian. I guess we tend to teach each other the same things, and the same ideas are prevalent in one area. But again, I think we can be pretty confident that Acts chapter 13 and 14 these are the churches to whom Paul wrote, and he wrote as soon as he got back, before he went down to Jerusalem. He wrote in a very quick emergency tone, because if this letter is not accepted as true, then his whole gospel, his whole ministry is for nothing. As he will say, I made all this effort and there's nothing coming of it. We'll stop here with this segment. And in segments 2 and 3, we'll consider the first chapter, which you should have translated verses 1 to 10, and we'll talk about the rest of the verses in the chapter as well.